In this video, we are looking into the public sector. So we are going to discuss in detail what is the public sector, the reasons for public sector failure. We are going to discuss the fiscal policy once again. We are going to also discuss public sector provisioning as well as the taxation part of the public sector, which includes the Laffer curve graph. So if that's one of the things you've been struggling with, this video we are going to help you handle that. This video is also divided into chapters, so if you want to skip to any specific part, you are welcome to fast forward to the part that you want to skip to. Otherwise, let's get started with the discussion of what exactly is the public sector. So when we are talking about the public sector, we are talking about the government or the state, if you want to put it that way. So it is the state or the government. It provides public goods and services to citizens of the country. It also collects taxes from the citizens as well as the businesses in the country. It is also responsible for creating policies for stimulating economic growth. So we know what the government is, and we know that in a country, remember when we were doing the circular flow, we discussed that we have the government right at the center of our circular flow, and that government is responsible for providing public goods and services to households, but it is also responsible from collecting tax from them as well as from businesses. So that's what the state does. So we discuss that taxation of why do they collect it and why do they do with it. What they do with it, they do what the public sector is supposed to do, which is provide public goods and services. So that is the main responsibility of the public sector, is to provide public goods and services. So whenever you are asked to discuss what a public sector is, it is the government that is responsible for providing goods and services with the money it collects from taxes, and it also creates policies that helps it govern the provision of these goods and services. So what is public sector failure? For public sector failure is when now the public sector is failing to do what it's supposed to do, its only responsibility, which is to provide public goods and services to the citizens of the country. So if it can't do that, then we say that the public sector has failed, because that is its responsibility. So we have reasons as to why the public sector fails. The first reason is what we call management failure. We also have apathy, lack of motivation, bureaucracy, structural weakness, and special interest groups. So these are the 6 reasons why the public sector fails. And so we are going to discuss what does each and every single one of these failures mean, and how do they occur, right? So let's start with our management failure. A management failure occurs due to ignorance, such as lack of training and leadership and experiences. In who? In the people that are elected by the government to be able to provide the services to the citizens of the country. So here we are talking about people like councillors, we are talking about public servants, people that you find working at your home affairs, for example. If those people do not manage the resources that the government has given them, well, we have what we call management failure. Then we have apathy. Apathy basically is the lack of feeling for people. You don't take accountability for the disadvantage that you're calling to people. So this is the apathy of government officials, as they do not show accountability in the delivery of services. They are corrupt and do not care about the welfare of the citizens. So that's what we call apathy. They're not caring about the people of the country and the resources that they've been given to take care of the people with. Then we get to lack of motivation. Lack of motivation, again, in government workers, is they rarely receive incentives for successful services and delivery. We all know that they do say people who work for the government are the worst paid employees. They complain about their benefits, they complain about the income that they earn. So they get lack of motivation from earning that little income that they earn. And then we get to bureaucracy. What is bureaucracy? Basically, bureaucracy, we're talking about bureaucrats, who are the people within the government that are only interested in the rules, even if they are at the expense of the efficiency of services. So somebody saying we need to collect tax because it's a government law, but not paying attention to who are you collecting this tax from. They end up collecting tax from poor people, for example. So things like that, that's what we call bureaucracy. You care about the law more than the welfare of the people. Then we have structural weakness, which occurs when the objectives of the public sector are not met or when they work against each other. So one objective may be when the objectives of the government are trying to clash. So they're trying to collect tax but also give eliminate poverty in our community. So if you're trying to eliminate poverty, then why are you taking money from people, type of thing. So they have to come up with policies that make sure that they work proper. So there has to be structural strength instead of weakness. And then the last one is the special interest groups such as farmers and trade unions who attempt to influence the government to their own advantage. So special interest groups are those groups that can group themselves together and come up with laws, but usually when they do that, they only work out with the government what works for them at the expense of everybody else. So if all farmers are not paying tax, it means everybody else is gonna have to carry their weight. So let's look at a question, right, based on this, or how the public sector will be tested in your question. So we have a case study there. It says, study the information below and answer the questions that follow. We see bureaucracy and efficiency. Bureaucracy is coming in, efficiency is going out. And it says, South African politicians, not bureaucrats, stands in the way of professional civil service. It says, bureaucracy hampering action in energy crisis, says presidency DG Pindile Baleni. And then we have roads fall apart when bureaucracy moves at snail's pace in Mamelodi. So basically what we are seeing with that picture first that looks like the road sign, it says that bureaucracy is entering and efficiency is going out. What we want when we're talking about the delivery of public goods and services to our community, we want efficiency more than anything. So if you are going to respect laws more than you respect the efficiency of delivering the services, then you have missed it. So our question in 2.3.1 says, identify a reason for public sector failure from the information below. We know that bureaucracy is one of our public reasonings for public failure. It's in the title itself of our case study. So our answer there will be bureaucracy. Then because I want us to cover the questions of the information we've covered so far, we are going to skip the next question, which is 2.3.2 that speaks about fiscal policy. We'll discuss it later. We'll jump to 2.3.3 that says briefly describe the term public sector failure. So basically the question is asking you, what is public sector failure? So how can you describe it in your own English? Public sector failure occurs when the public sector fails to allocate resources efficiently and effectively. Remember, the public sector's job, whole point, responsibility is to provide goods and services. If it fails, that's what we mean. That's what we call public sector failure. So we are also going to skip the next question, which is 2.3.4. It talks about provisioning, so we'll also discuss that later. We are going to skip to the last one, which is 2.3.5. It says, how can public sector failure affect the economy? So if the government fails to provide the goods and services that it's supposed to provide to the citizens of the country, how would that affect our economy? Meaning that first topic we discussed in the circular flow. By the way, if you haven't seen that video, make sure you go start with it. So what happens? Public sector failure results in low economic growth and high unemployment. The failure to provide public services will cause social instability. So these two reasons, the number one reason being unemployment, one of the things that the government provides to the citizens is the creation of jobs. So if it fails, it means people in the country are unemployed, which dampens their economic growth. And then also social instability, we are talking about the rich and poor divide. So if the rich continue to get rich and there's nobody helping the poor with things like grants, it means that the poor people in the country will continue to suffer. They will not be able to afford clinics, their children will not be able to go to school and such. So now that we have discussed those, we are going to go back to the questions that we skipped. The first one being about the fiscal policy in 2.3.2. It says name one feature of fiscal policy. So before we answer that question, let's get into discussing what is the fiscal policy. In the previous video where we were doing the business cycle, we discussed fiscal policy and monetary policy. It's that same fiscal policy basically, but we are hammering on it some more now. So if you forgot what fiscal policy is, it refers to the action taken by the government through taxation, government spending and borrowing in order to influence economic activity. So basically is the government trying to control the circular flow using the resources that the government has at its disposal, which is taxation. Government spending is when they provide basically the public goods and services, and the government also has the ability to borrow money in order to do this thing. So if the taxes are not enough, but they have allocated a lot of things in the budget that are required in the country, what the government can do, it can also borrow in order to meet those needs. So that's what we call the fiscal policy. Basically, all of those things are regulated in the fiscal policy. So the fiscal policy itself also has some features of its own. So it has three main features. The first one being that it is goal bound. That means the government sets economic and social goals, and it is then uses the budget to realize those goals. So goal bound means that they have certain goals, they have to meet them. Usually we get to know of these goals in the budget that they discuss at February every year, right? And then we have the second feature being that it is demand biased. The fiscal policy is first demand side policy. It is supported through infrastructure. So when we did the previous video of the business cycle, you know that when we were discussing policies there, we talked about the demand side policy, and we said that that is a new economic paradigm policy, but basically it represents the fiscal policy. So it started off as the fiscal policy, but in the new economic paradigm we call it the demand side policy. But they're both basically dependent on increasing aggregate demand in the economy. When the households demand more goods, it means that the businesses will have to produce more. If they have to produce more, it means now they will have to hire more labor. So it's basically stimulating the economy using demand and relying on the ripple effect that the demand is going to create to improve the economic growth. And then the third feature is we say that it is cyclical, meaning that the fiscal policy is affected by the business cycle. As we've just discussed, the government income increases during the upswing. So cyclical meaning that it's going to have an upswing and then it's going to have a downswing, just as the business cycle is. So if you miss the discussion on the business cycle, be sure to make sure that you go back to the previous video where you will understand how the business cycle works. So basically, when we are saying that one feature of the fiscal policy is that it's cyclical, we are just saying that it is part of the business cycle that we have discussed in the previous video. And even when you go to the previous video, you will see we did discuss the fiscal policy. Basically, in your grade 12 economics, that's where you start meeting your fiscal policy for the first time, is when we are discussing the business cycle. So now that we know all of that information, we can go ahead and answer our 2.3.2, which says name one feature of the fiscal policy. We said that it was goal bound, we said that it was demand biased, and it was cyclical. It said one, so any one of these that you can remember is up to you. We are then going to jump back to another question that we skipped before, which was 2.3.4. It says explain the impact of high state debt on the provisioning of public goods and services. And the reason we skipped it was because this question speaks about public sector provisioning, which we haven't discussed and we are going to do now before we answer this question. So let's get into the discussion of what is public sector provisioning. So basically, public sector provisioning, we are talking about the public sector doing what it was meant to do, which is to provide goods and services. So usually for us to end up with a public sector failure is because we have what we call provisioning problems, meaning they were trying to provide, but they ran into some problems, and those problems include accountability, efficiency, assessing of needs, pricing policy, parastatals, privatization slash nationalization. So when we are talking accountability, we are basically trying to ask the question, who is accountable for effective delivery of public goods and services? If we don't have anybody responsible for that, that's where now we will have a provisioning, because who's supposed to provide those services to the public? And then when we're talking about efficiency, we are basically asking the question, are the public goods and services delivered promptly at a desired quantity and quality? Because it's one thing to say we have provided and built roads, for example, but the roads within a year are teared down and they have potholes, so that it's not efficient. And then in 3, we are saying assessing of needs. So basically the question we are asking there is, how can the government determine what the public truly needs? Because it's very difficult to decide whether what is important to the public between, let's say, building of a road or building of a new school. What is more needed in that community? In 4, pricing policy, the question we are asking is which service should be free and which should not be free, because the government has to make some money at some point. So there are some things that are provided by the government but are really not free. When we are looking at parastatals, we are looking at some state-owned enterprises. That's what parastatals are. So we are saying, how can the state-owned enterprises help with the provisioning of public goods and services? So those businesses basically that are owned by the government, how can they help the government in providing goods and services to people? And then in privatization slash nationalization, we are saying which enterprises that are already in existence should be privatized and which should be nationalized, because that is going to affect our economy and provision as well. So now that we know all of that information, we can go ahead, try to answer our 2.3.4 question, which said, explain the impact of high state debt on the provisioning of public goods and services. We've just seen that there is some problems that the government is facing in trying to provide goods and services. So according to this question, we add one more problem to that on top of all of this, the government has a very high debt that it's trying to repay. So what is this going to do for our government? With a high state debt, the government would have to focus on repaying the debt instead of providing public goods and services. Because the thing about debts is you have to pay them back, and they will end up having to be prioritized, which means the citizens are going to suffer because they can't do both. So then we also move on to discussing the taxation, because that's where the money comes from, and when it is short, that's when we need to borrow. So the discussion of the tax becomes very important. So we are saying, what are the importance of tax? So the government collects tax to be able to pay for public goods and services. They use it to redistribute income, meaning how do we make sure that the rich don't continue to get richer while the poor continue to get poorer. So that's where they introduce things like tax bracket. You know that the higher you earn, the more tax you have to pay according to the tax tables and the tax bracket. Those of you who do math literacy know about these tax tables that I'm talking about. They also use it to discourage the use of demerit goods and import goods. So demerit goods, we are just basically talking about goods like cigarettes and snuff. So those things, there's high tax on them just to discourage people from buying them. Then we also have something called the tax systems. We have a progressive tax system and a regressive tax system. What is a progressive tax system? The progressive tax system is where the tax rate increases as your income increases. So this is the tax brackets I was just telling you about, that the more income you earn in the higher tax bracket you fall under, which means even your rate of income increases. So this progressive tax system is used to achieve an even distribution of income. Then in regressive tax, we say it's the tax decreases as your income decreases, but with fiscal policy, this system results in an uneven distribution of income. We also have something in taxation called the Laffer curve. So the Laffer curve basically describes the relationship between the income that you earn, which is your tax revenue, and the tax rate that is charged on the income that you earn. So you will see on the Laffer curve, on the y-axis and the x-axis, we have tax revenue and the tax rate. The tax rate is going to be in percentages. So in there they have just put it, because this is a template, it just says T1 and T2, but usually those numbers would be as percentages, whereas on the y-axis we have R1 and R. Usually those would be the value rands. So you will see as the rand goes up, meaning your income in rand increases, your tax rate is also going to move from 0 to something. And you will also see that at the highest amount that you will ever earn, which is at the R at the top, you see that it goes to B, which goes down to 50%. So meaning the highest interest rate that the government can charge and still make an income is going to be 50%, meaning if they charge 100%, they are going to make a loss. Why? Because people will be forced to do things like tax evasions and not even get jobs, because what would be the point to work for an income that's just going to go to the government at the end of the day? So in 4.2, we have a question that's also focusing on the Laffer curve as we know it. The only difference is that they've now put amounts where there was T1 and T2 and R1 and R2. So using that Laffer curve, we are answering the following questions. In 4.2.1, it says identify the tax rate at which the government maximizes revenue, and that is 50%. If they charge anything more than 50%, they will lose. Why? People will not see the need to pay that tax because it will be too much. And then at 4.2.2, name any form of indirect tax paid by households to the government. So for household, an indirect tax that you have to always know at the top of your head is value added tax. It's that tax that I don't feel that I'm paying the tax because it's just included in my price of goods as I'm doing my shopping. And then in 4.2.3, it says briefly describe the term progressive tax. We have talked about tax system, and we said progressive tax is a tax system where the tax rate increases as your income and increases. And then in the next question, 4.2.4, it says explain the effect of regressive tax system on the income redistribution. So basically, this is the regressive tax is the opposite of progressive tax. We said regressive tax is where the tax rate decreases as your income decreases. And we also said in fiscal policy, the effect of this is that it makes the income to be unevenly distributed. So here they were not asking us what is regressive tax, they were asking us its effect, and its effect on the fiscal policy is that it unevenly distributes income, whereas progressive tax does the opposite, it evenly distributes income. So they're just the opposite of each other. Then the last question says, why will tax revenue decrease if the government imposes very high tax? It is higher than 50%, and like we said, it may cause people to evade the tax. It may also discourage people from entering the labor market if most of their income will be taxed anyway, because people don't want to work for free. And if the tax is too much, people will also resort to things like tax evasion, which is a crime, but people will do it anyway. Concludes our discussion on public sector. Any questions, leave them in the comment section below.
To have YouTube recommend you more of my videos, be sure to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below.